Hello viewers, 4DIYers here with another tutorial video for everyone. In this particular video here, I'll be doing a demonstration how to install and custom fit this double din head unit in this Ford Ranger. The same procedure can also be used on a Mazda B series truck from the same generation. A link to this head unit from Auto Pumpkin's website will be included in the description below, so be sure to check it out. The head unit I'm working with here is a Pumpkin double din 7-inch touchscreen with an Android 8.0 interface that also has a GPS navigation, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and a backup camera. Therefore, this tutorial will also include how to install the GPS antenna, microphone for the hands-free, Wi-Fi antenna, and backup camera. And Auto Pumpkin has also sent me an OBD2 code reader, which will enable the head unit to show live data and can scan fault codes. Included with the head unit will be the wiring harness, mounting brackets with fasteners, trim piece which goes around the outside of the head unit, and some other features which have been mentioned just a minute ago. Now, in order to install this in a Ford Ranger, a faceplate is something required for some vehicles. However, this will require some modifications to the radio bezel for a custom fit, and will also need a generic plug-and-play wiring harness. Some people choose to cut out the factory harness, which is not something I'd recommend. It's not only a headache sorting out which wire does what, but if you want to keep the head unit and part ways with your vehicle, you can't reinstall the factory unit. Plug-and-play wiring kits can be purchased at your local auto parts store or electronics store or online. One plug tends to fit a generic model of vehicles. As you can see with this plug, all the models and years it does fit is printed on the back side of the package. Considering we are working with electronics, it's best to disconnect the negative side of the battery to cut the power to the truck. While the stereo is off, it still does have constant power to remember its presets, such as the radio stations and time. The factory stereo can be removed by itself, or in this case, considering the bezel needs to be removed, I'm just removing the whole assembly at once. Remove the two 7mm fasteners above the HVAC panel. Pull the bezel out. There will be various clips around the perimeter of the bezel. Once it's far enough out, disconnect the 12-volt auxiliary plug, disconnect the cigarette lighter, and finally disconnect the radio. There will be an antenna wire along with the main harness. For removing the radio from the bezel, a removal tool can be used, but instead you can depress the spring tangs on the side by hand and then push the radio out. What I find is easiest is to do one side at a time. Now there is a slight problem as the head unit is slightly larger than the opening. The head unit can be installed behind the bezel, but personally I find it sits too far in. Then there is also the risk of clearance issues for the wiring on the rear. In order to make it fit, some cutting does need to be done. I would recommend taping off the surrounding surface so you don't risk damaging the rubber coated trim. I used electrical tape from the start, which is quite thick and provides great protection. But due to the cold weather, it's starting to fall off on its own, so I switched over to another type of tape. Using a rotary tool, you can grind that lip down using a carbide bit or a drum sander with a heavy grit wheel. Take your time, don't remove too much material. I prefer to limit the material removal, test fitting the head unit along the way. A file is used to square off the corners as the cutting bit on the rotary tool leaves a small radius behind, and this does cause some interference with the head unit face. If you remove too much material, then it's too hard to put back in and you may need a new radio bezel. Once that lip was removed, the head unit does fit much better, but I still wasn't satisfied as it sits too far in. I traced out the location of the head unit's face. The top and bottom only need to be notched out. I actually ended up doing this twice. You can only trace out about 1/4 inch at a time. There is not any interference on the sides, so there's no reason to remove material there. Using a cutting disc on a rotary tool, this is one of the easier ways I've found to remove the plastic. When those cuts are made, I try to keep it square with the bezel, but you do have the option of slightly angling the head unit to the driver. This is based on your personal preference. After a majority of the material has been removed, a file, drum sander, carbide bit, or a hot knife can be used to level out those cuts and smoothen the surface. When it's close, finish up with 320 grit sandpaper on those cut edges for a fine finish. While the Pumpkin head unit did come with L brackets, these do need to be modified so they can mount to the radio bezel in the truck. I used a wood block as a mounting point, clamped down a piece of metal on the one side so the bracket doesn't become deformed, Then another piece of steel was used, about 3/16 thick, to achieve that kick. Once everything gets connected, you'll see how this goes together. Using a hammer, I'm using a dead blow hammer which won't mark up the bracket once it's folded over. Ensure those clamps are tight as they can move when hammering. Then using an aluminum or brass block, something that's soft which won't damage the bracket, tighten up the folded over portion. Do the same with the other bracket. While there is aftermarket installation kits available, they may only lock the head unit in one direction and more modifications will need to be made to the radio bezel. Once done, this is what I'm left with. You can of course wrap the brackets in tape to protect them from any scratching. These however have a clear film as protection from new, which did provide enough of a barrier. To fasten those brackets to the radio bezel, install the brackets into place so the holes can be marked out. The supplied fasteners I found were too short, so you will need your own most likely. It requires 1032 fasteners. Make sure they're not too long as they can damage the components inside. Once those holes have been marked out, the plastic bezel is thick inside so you don't necessarily need nuts to hold everything in place. I'm going to thread the holes instead. The holes do need to be tapped for the fasteners. Using a tap index, the hole needs to be drilled to 5/32 of an inch. Here's the wiring harness for the new head unit. It does have an ISO plug already installed, but unfortunately this truck does not take that type of connector. While some wiring is ran between connectors, others are labeled for their function, so it's easy to follow. As mentioned earlier, I did purchase a generic plug-and-play harness for this truck to make the installation easier. This truck only uses one plug, so I'll simplify the setup to some extent so it looks cleaner. It doesn't take up much room and will be easier to understand. You can see the harness wiring is wide off in certain areas, either at the plug or partway in the wiring. Auto Pumpkin also supplies easy to follow instructions along with wiring diagrams. The wiring diagram will list the color coding for the wires along with their function. The color coding also follows a generic standard which is typically found with aftermarket plug-and-play harnesses. Wiring tends to be very straightforward as you only need to match up the color coding. With a plug-and-play harness, this also comes with a wiring chart listing which color is for what function. I went ahead and cut off the gray connector. More connectors will be removed later. Now cut off the ISO plug, leaving longer pigtails for the head unit side. Strip the wiring about an inch. This will leave enough room for soldering. As a test run to ensure everything is connected correctly, you can twist the connections together and then tape up everything using electrical tape. This will allow for a brief test run, confirming the speakers and other wiring is connecting correctly. I would certainly recommend this if you're new to wiring. However, this is not a permanent connection solution and should only be done for testing purposes. To simplify the wiring some more, I cut the rest of the connectors off and only left the one behind which is needed. The wires were also trimmed to size and then stripped for soldering. There should be about an inch of exposed conductor on each side for soldering. To keep everything clean and properly color coded, I used colored heat shrink. This wiring isn't exposed to weather, so an adhesive filled shrink tube isn't necessary. Make sure the heat shrink is installed before soldering that joint. For soldering, I do have a guide on that if you're new to it, and I would certainly recommend watching that video. The type of connection I'm using for soldering is known as a lineman splice or a Western Union. Finish up with heat shrink, use a heat gun. I don't recommend using a lighter or torch as you can burn the heat shrink or wire's insulation. I do have a couple more wires needing to be connected, which will be done in the truck. Partway through putting the heat shrink on, as you can see I have all the matched up wires with the colors and functions. I prefer using soldered connections as it looks cleaner, however there is a large debate as to which connection is best between soldering and crimping. In order to run some of that wiring in the truck, the pillar trim on the sides of the windshield do need to be removed. The removal process is very straightforward. With this Ranger there are no fasteners that need to be removed. Simply grab onto the upper portion along the roof's edge and then slowly unclip it. There will be a couple clips along the headliner and a couple more along the windshield pillar, then lift the trim straight out. You can install the Wi-Fi antenna under the headliner at the highest point. However, after a test I did find the reception was excellent at the pillar. With the truck in the driveway, my internet router is about 70 feet away in the house and I was still able to achieve a connection. Make sure the surface is clean before doing so. Even give the area a wipe down with rubbing alcohol to remove any dust. A Wi-Fi antenna comes with an adhesive backer. Remove the paper to expose the adhesive and then stick it onto the surface. Firmly press the antenna into place with the wire facing down, just below the pillar clip area. With the loose wire, there's no spots to fasten it down with clips or cable ties. The wire should be held into place as you can risk getting it pinched, possibly damaging the conductor inside. For this I'm using butyl tape. I do have a roll left over from a previous project. I cut 1-inch pieces, folded them in half to increase the thickness, and this will help the adhesive mold around the wire. Straightening the wire can be tough, especially when it's cold. Then stick the wire into place away from the trim's edge or clips. Pulling down the glove box does make it a little easier to run the wire, and it only requires the sides to be pulled in to disconnect the tabs, then pull it straight out. Then feed the wire in between the pillar and dashboard. There is a small slot that it can drop down. Then you'll need to feel around for the wire inside the dashboard. A light may help, and then pull it out. The factory radio antenna wire is behind the glove box, so you can follow its path with cable ties to where the new head unit will be. I use small cable ties. They keep everything neat and prevent the wires from tangling up with any other components. Any excess wire can be rolled up in behind the head unit and tied off. Here's what the Wi-Fi antenna looks like when it's in place. Another view of the Wi-Fi antenna wire behind the glove box. The microphone wire will be ran in a similar way like the Wi-Fi antenna. The trim is also removed. In this case, however, the microphone is mounted on the sun visor with a little clip. The microphone should be mounted somewhat in front of the driver. If you want your occupants to have access to it, then the center of the truck is best. It should also be away from any vents or speakers or even the side window to reduce the chance of any background noise. Then run the wire along the top edge of the headliner. Be careful not to damage the headliner, then down the pillar. I use the same butyl tape to hold the wire into place, away from the trim's edge and clips so it doesn't get pinched. While the microphone does use a large connector, I decided to run the wire in behind the fuse box location. There is a big enough slot opening, and then feed it under the dash. Once under the dash, you can feed it above all the components and into the new head unit area. I have already tested the microphone and Wi-Fi antennas, so I know everything is functioning correctly. Once you have confirmed everything is working, reinstall the pillar trim. The backup camera will need to be ran from the head unit all the way to the rear of the truck. It's not overly complicated, and the wire does have a connection for the camera, so this main wire will need to be ran to the rear of the truck. This may vary with extended cab or long box trucks. I would recommend taping off the plug for the camera so there isn't any chance of dirt entering the connector that may cause issues. You can drill a hole in the firewall and install a rubber grommet or cut a small slit in existing rubber grommets. For this, I use the hood release cable. There is an exit point for the factory wiring towards the rear of the cab, but this involves pulling up the floor covering, either the carpet or rubber floor mat depending on what your truck's equipped with. I decided to run the wire along the parking brake cable, used cable dies to hold it in place, then along the factory wiring to the rear taillight on the driver's side. The camera wiring needs a switched reverse wire in order to activate the camera and screen. Some Rangers have a reverse wire in the cab, however this can vary between models and years. The camera wiring for the positive and negative switching wires is only about 3 feet long, so in this situation it's more convenient to hook it up to the reverse light. The camera wire was ran behind the back bumper and will be mounted to the license plate cover. For hooking up the reverse wire, solderless connectors can be used to tee into the wire. However, this isn't something I would recommend, as you can cut the conductor, and it also allows for moisture penetration, eventually corroding the wire. We'll need to determine which is the positive and negative. I already know the black with the pink stripe is positive, but just to be safe, use a multimeter to check this. Remove the connector, then turn the ignition to the on position without the engine running. The wheels will need to be blocked or activate the parking brake because the truck can roll away. Pull the transmission selector into reverse to activate the reverse lights, and then probe the connector. You'll have a positive and a negative probe. If the value on the multimeter is negative, the probes are mixed up and you'll need to reverse the polarity. When the value is positive, the red probe is on the positive wire and the negative probe is on the negative wire. I stripped the wires using a razor knife, enough to do a T-splice. The pigtails for the camera ground and power were also shortened, and then the wires were stripped. The red wire goes to black with a pink stripe, and the black wire connects to the black wire. Solder the wire into place. If you want to add an additional feature, especially if you're towing with your truck often, you can run the camera on a switch circuit which allows you to control the camera manually instead. For a waterproof seal, liquid tape is used, and you'll be looking at about 3 coats for sufficient coverage, especially on those cooler days. Connect the camera signal wire. Split loop casing should also be applied to the connector as added protection from the outdoor elements. Then wrap it up with electrical tape to keep it from falling off. Wrap up the wiring in the factory casing, then apply electrical tape to hold it together. Tie up the wires in behind the taillight to keep everything in place and safe. The split loop casing can be used to case the camera wire under the truck for added protection. This is especially important if you plan on driving your vehicle on rougher terrain. Then reinstall the taillight. For the camera, this was mounted to the license plate cover. Mounting points and locations can vary depending on your personal preference. While this is a small truck and easy enough to reverse to a trailer, this camera will sit just behind the hitch for convenience. The camera should be high enough so its view isn't obscured by any objects such as the bumper or hitch ball. When the head unit is hooked up, you can even test the camera before fastening it in place. 2 screws are supplied with the camera for installation, and I drilled pilot holes on the license plate cover. The camera position should be centered with the rear of the truck, and I have also bent the bracket in order to suit its mounting point. Finally, the wire connected to the RCA wire for the camera needs to be connected to the reverse wire from the head unit's harness. The wire will have a reverse label tag, and it is an orange with black stripe. I did solder this connection, and then finished up with heat shrink. Installing the head unit in the radio bezel, make sure it's tightened in place and properly positioned so we can fit the new trim. There is a trim piece that was supplied with the head unit which goes around the perimeter of the face. The gap on the top and bottom personally I think looks good. However, the sides have too large of a gap, and it also exposes the fasteners from the brackets holding the head unit in behind. So these will be getting cut down and filed to size. The plastic isn't overly hard, it does take some patience with a razor knife, but a coarse file can cut it down quite quickly. Continuously test fit these pieces along the way, making sure they are the correct size and not cut too small. After a bit of time and patience, the fill-in pieces are fitted to size. On the button side, there is a slightly larger gap to account for the door which pops open for the micro SD card. In order to fasten these in place, I used a plastic adhesive which I had laying around. The stuff I have is used for auto body repair applications and is a 2-part product, but there is many other plastic compatible adhesives on the market which will work for this. Mix the product accordingly. I am using a toothpick as an applicator. The plastic pieces have been cleaned using rubbing alcohol to remove any contaminants. Tape was applied for a reference edge for the trim pieces. Adhesive will need to be applied away from the tape's edge. You don't need an excessive amount of adhesive, more will be applied after. Carefully drop the pieces into place. These can fall in on an angle, so make sure they're square. Using paper or cardboard, tuck the pieces along the edge between the head unit, pushing the filler pieces tight against the radio bezel, then allow the adhesive to set up and dry. After it has dried somewhat, remove the paper or cardboard, then remove the head unit. Mix up more adhesive and apply it to the back side of those filler pieces. Don't apply too much as you may need to reinstall the head unit to keep everything in place. I went ahead and applied painter's tape to the edge of the head unit so it doesn't come in contact with any adhesive, then allow it to cure. Once it has been cured, the head unit can be fastened into place. While everything is being bolted down, you can also see how the brackets fit into place, going around the bezel and connecting to the head unit's side. The head unit can play videos or movies, and due to some government regulations, there must be a safety switch installed so the driver cannot control this feature when the vehicle is in motion. However, I did find a function to disable this feature in the head unit's options. The extra parking wire from the head unit's harness that wasn't part of the ISO plug is labeled for parking and is pink in color. I ran an 18 gauge wire matching the same path as the RCA for the reverse camera and microphone wire for the hands-free to the underside of the dashboard. This will be connected to the switch on the parking brake. Solderless crimp connectors can be used here to utilize the factory switch hookup. A male and female spade connectors are required. A small jumper wire is also needed. The wiring comes from the head unit will have a female connector that connects to the factory switch. A jumper wire is also installed here. At the end of the jumper wire is a male spade connector. This is where the factory female spade connector attaches to. The wire needs to be tied off when in place so it doesn't interfere with the parking brake mechanism. There are a few unused wires, both from the head unit side and the truck side. One is the dimmer ground, another is a steering wheel ground, amplifier, and antenna wires. For these, I used a short piece of adhesive-filled shrink tube, applied it over the end of the wire, and made sure it was recessed inside a short distance. Once it is heated up, you can pinch the end off, which completely closes off the wire. The GPS antenna here is very easy to install. Typically, these are recommended to be installed on the outside of the vehicle, but for a clean look, you can hide this on the inside of the dash onto metal bracing. The plastic cover needs to be facing an open area such as the windshield, so the adhesive side faces down. It's always a good idea to test its location before finalizing it. It's best to mount it on a metal surface as it boosts the signal strength. The wire provided is quite long, so I rolled it up and tucked it inside the dash. To give you a peek under the dashboard on the driver's side once everything has been finalized, don't be afraid to use too many cable ties. The last thing you want is the wiring becoming tangled in a mechanism. Watch out for the shifter linkage at the top as well. The USB wire comes with connectors that plugs into the back of the head unit, and the same connection is used for the hands-free microphone too. The wire is quite long, so you do have quite a few different options to run this in different areas of the cab. Instead, I rolled up the wire and used the glove box for the USB connections, then tied the wire up to the dashboard frame so it stays in place. Cleaning up the wiring should be done. It keeps everything a bit more organized within the dashboard, and it also makes everything easier to install when the head unit goes into place without any interferences. Use cable ties to hold together rolled up wire and to keep certain wires together. I also found moving some of the factory wiring locations did help. The factory radio harness is moved under the plastic brace to the right side of the opening. The antenna is routed under the plastic brace to the left side of the opening. The reverse camera wires, microphone, and USB harness are directed to the left side of the opening. Auto Pumpkin does include an RCA video output harness and an audio RCA output harness, which isn't needed for this truck, so this was removed completely simply by clipping the cable ties. Don't forget to peel off that protective film on the case when installing the head unit. And finally, the installation, connecting all the wiring, both on the new and old components. I left the head unit wiring a little longer so I can connect it first, and there is plenty of room to work with. The Wi-Fi and GPS antennas can be snugged up using a 8mm wrench so they don't loosen up over time. Connect the 12-volt auxiliary plug and cigarette lighter. Then push the head unit into the dash, being careful not to pinch any wires and snapping the bezel back into place. Reinstall the bezel fasteners. Then reconnect the truck's battery and you're ready to enjoy the new head unit. I will have a full walkthrough and review of the new head unit in the upcoming weeks, but I can do a quick demonstration just as a preview. As mentioned before, this operates on an Android interface. It's very user-friendly and extremely straightforward. Currently, I don't have a phone paired with the head unit via Bluetooth, but I will eventually do that for the next video. I already have a micro SD card inserted with music on it, and that card will immediately pop up. Going back to a previous menu is made quite easy using the back button on the left. The radio can be accessed by the icons along the bottom of the screen. For selecting known stations, there is a quick search box. Once that station has been selected, press and hold that preset to memorize it. Pull down the menu from the top on the screen. This will show various settings such as the Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, volume, brightness, equalizer, and an operation cleanup. Current updating downloads are also shown too. Under settings, there are various areas to personalize this head unit and its operation. We can even change the color of the buttons. This not only has presets, but you can customize the tint, having a wide range. It's extremely easy to select a color matching your vehicle. Under driving settings, there is an option for allowing the user to watch videos while the vehicle is in motion. Going into the apps menu, this head unit does come with many features already installed. Anything from photos, video, GPS, music, file browser, internet browser, email, calendar, calculator, clock, DVR if you have that hooked up, App Store, and this torque app, which is quite a cool feature. With the OBD2 transmitter, you can view any live data and even check the engine's codes. New videos are released every week on my channel. Be sure to hit that thumbs up button. It's a huge help to me, and leave a comment below if you found this tutorial helpful. Don't forget to follow my social media pages such as Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to keep up to date with my latest projects. If you're not a subscriber, be sure to also hit that subscribe button, and thank you for watching.